Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of the Dairy Signal. Glad to either have you back or here for the first time. We have a lot in store for you as you're tuning in. You're probably curious about where the growing season is at, what may be in store for us, and if you're in some of those districts or some of those regions that are either wet or super dry, how can we pivot to still yet be successful in this growing year? So you are in for a treat. We have a great friend with us here today as we have John Geiser, who's sitting in a new seat, a new role, if you will, and we're excited to have him here again on the Dairy Signal. So again, John Geiser, I'll let him kind of talk through again this new journey that he's on, but he is the dairy nutrition and management consultant with Progressive Dairy Solutions. So a great friend, great partner, and again, welcome back, John. And you are on mute, so we're truly testing your technology skills here.
I'm still somewhat savvy with this Zoom thing, right? We all learned how to use this through COVID, but yeah, thank you for the lead in and the intro. I was somewhat expecting a fact of the day or maybe that's to come yet. I haven't looked into my almanac to figure out what today the signal date it corresponds to. I know D-Day and our servicemen and women that fought for our freedom and the world's freedom. We just celebrated that, and God bless our servicemen and women and our veterans. But I don't know what today is aside from me joining UCASI and our professional dairy producers outstanding organization on the Signal today and talking about a little earlier than we anticipated the growing season. But it's ever changing. And sort of in that vein, yeah, I've made a career path change and move in the last few months. So I had previously enjoyed a strong tenure in an industry and supporting role. I've worked with the University of Wisconsin as an adjunct professor in a supporting capacity. I will continue to do that indefinitely into the future. Support our upper incoming students, graduate students, do some extension and outreach work by that way. But I've joined Progressive Dairy Solutions and excited to get closer to dairy farmers. Not that I was removed per se from dairy farms, but I was sort of 1 degree of separation removed and working in concert with a lot of great nutritionists and agronomists and advisors out there, groups such as PDP and yourself. But now back in the saddle, so to speak. When I got out of grad school, I did a bit of nutrition and management consulting work alongside my late father. Actually, he taught me a whole lot about how this world works, and now back in that role. So I've been telling people if I wasn't cut out for this and I made the wrong decision, I still remember how to milk cows. So I can always go back, and there's always people looking for a good milker in the parlor.
Absolutely. Always looking for good hands. But honestly, you've been blessed by being part of two phenomenal teams, and we're just glad that you've decided to stay with the dairy world. I mean, I enjoy working with you because you are so practical. You remember that background and that foundation, and even taking a lot of our academic, which they're doing great work, but being able to apply it back into the so what? What do we do with it? What can we do with it? So absolutely love working with you and all things that we're going to work and talk through today. And I didn't cut it out. I'm just trying to be respectful to some of our listeners who are like, just get to the point. As I get long-winded here, but I will, because true Cassie fashion, your fun fact for today is actually one of your national holidays. If you're familiar with a root beer float, it's actually originally called the Black Cow. So today is National Black Cow Day. It started out in Colorado, of all things. So if you need any reason to ever have a root beer float, today is your day to do that. So I had to slide and sneak that one in, and maybe after this will be your sweet treat for the afternoon here, John.
Anything with ice cream is a-okay in my book. At church on Sunday, we were celebrating a teacher who's going on to serve in another call, but we had Domino's pizza filled with grande cheese, which was excellent. And then we had root beer floats, and you can guess which order. They're both intriguing, but when our kids, when we walked out of service, what they ran toward and the order of operations wasn't necessarily ideal in my mind as a nutritionist. But we are proud supporters of the dairy industry by way of our ice cream mixed with our root beer. There was some orange soda in there too. I don't know what in the world that was. I didn't ask any questions. Just, all right, go on. You do whatever you're going to do. We're going to send you outside after that.
Absolutely. Let them run it off. But John, I had the ability or the what do I say? I was blessed to talk to you even last week catch you on the road here, there, and everywhere. You truly joined a new team and were boots on the ground running in all things good. But as I was able to catch up with you, let's just start with kind of that recap of what you've been experiencing kind of just regionally across the US, not just here as we take for granted here in the Midwest.
So the last, I guess, 5 weeks now since I've charted out this new path and stepping in a different direction, have been a whirlwind. To use the cliche, drinking out of a fire hose is putting it lightly, but it's been awesome to carry some different conversations and be woven into some different decision making processes. And yeah, we tend to operate, and I'll refer to a few times over today. Wrote a Hordes Dairyman Intel newsletter article and contribution that just landed yesterday. So for those of you listening in, either live or after the fact, if you're not Hordes Dairyman Intel newsletter subscribers, I would encourage you to do so. Shameless plug. I will continue to write for Hordes Dairyman, the feeding fundamentals column, and then also the feed and forage quality column in Hay and Forage Grower. So I look forward to continuing to support but both of those outreach efforts and those print publications. But the contribution to the newsletter this week, we shifted gears in terms of where I thought I might steer the conversation, and it's right in line, Cassie, with our conversation last week when I was traveling out to a dairy, and both in our conversation and in the newsletter, we tend to operate with blinders. So for those that are sitting at their computer and viewing me as I speak with my hands as much as my words, like I live in amongst the Amish, and so horse blinders are a thing that I see daily, and we put blinders on our horses to the side so that we keep them focused. Well, we'll operate often within our day to day and week to week without a broader understanding and awareness of what's happening around us. And I continue to poke fun at myself. That's one of my personality characteristics. Like, I don't need horse blinders. This is one of my faults as a human, is not having any idea what's going on around me. I'm objective oriented. I see where we want to go, maybe some great research that I think we can apply, but then I kind of lose touch with the periphery and some things happening. And case in point, I wasn't necessarily aware of really challenging growing conditions that many are experiencing in dairy forage growing and feed growing regions across the U.S. There are a lot of dairy cows outside of the upper Midwest where I reside in Wisconsin, and the growing conditions have been 180 degrees different from what I and we have been experiencing in the upper Midwest. And in the Hordes newsletter, and then I would encourage all of you to utilize some of the precip tools that exist out there. So I'll go to NOAA.gov, for example, and I'll look at water year-to-date charts and reports, and I'll just come up with some visuals. And I won't pull it open today. I'll just verbalize it. But there's a clear and stark contrast in the amount of rainfall that we've experienced across the U.S., corresponding to what must be some clear and repetitive weather pattern that's showing up. However, the jet stream is moving in the upper Midwest, I would say we're hanging around average. I don't know the number exactly with precip, but if we look at, say, Missouri up through Toronto, and then the Northeast in PA and Western and upstate New York, they're drenched, absolutely soaked, to the point where we don't have corn in the ground yet for many acres. Just talked to another of my colleagues where we still don't have corn in the ground, and so we are past the point of hitting the panic button. That's not to mean we should be panicking, but there is a lot of concern with regards to how are we going to make this work, and we'll make it work. Our producers out there, Cassie, yourself are included, are incredibly strong-willed, and we find ways to make things work. However, those farming to the south and to the east are going to need to make it work in a different fashion. So broadening my scope and view and our understanding of what's happening out there, and not just looking at and considering the great start to the season we've had in the upper Midwest, where we've gotten corn in, and probably the Western Corn Belt as well. You look at corn planting year to date and crop progress, looks excellent on a whole, but there are two bell curves within the kind of whole, or the normal, if you will, across the U.S. this year, which are driving some strong conversations.
Absolutely. So without maybe derailing with the direction of where you wanted to go. If let's take our partners, our friends out in the East Coast that don't have seed on the ground, or maybe they were lucky enough to get it and it may have drowned. How can we pivot at this point, knowing we're beginning, almost tipping into that middle part of June? They have similar
Mhm.
conditions. I mean, winter will come, regardless of where you're at, winter will come. So as far as the traditional diet, incorporating that haylage and things like that, how can we pivot? Are there alternatives? Like where, or excuse me, corn silage, where do we and how do we pivot?
So there are short and long-term strategies, and I appreciate how you queued that question up because we've got agronomic and forage production considerations that are probably a little bit more urgent or would be maybe prioritized a little bit higher. But then we also have some, I would say, mid to long-term nutrition strategies that we can deploy on farm with our current feed inventories to make better use of what we have relative to the unfolding conditions. And so I'll come back to and let's talk about some of our seed and maybe cropping options, but talking about nutrition strategies in the moment, cows don't have a forage requirement. So that's the first point to drive home. In fact, I think I've stated that a handful of times over in the last couple of weeks, and it wasn't necessarily with regards to challenging growing conditions and the unknown to the northeast, but cows don't have forage requirements. So we tend to, for the areas that can harvest Mother Nature's rainfall and we can grow forages cheaper than we can buy a lot of other feeds, higher forage rations and diets will, and often in many cases, be lower cost per hundredweight in terms of feed costs. But cows don't have a forage requirement. We can get away with anywhere from, say, 25 to 30% forage, all the way up to 70% forage. And that's a huge range. So, with that understanding, we can look to start stretching our feed inventories. And we've got strong margins right now and margin potential. And this is actually is a document I have queued up. So Jack, I'll share my screen here just in a moment. I always like to bring some of my dad's optimism, and so we've had pretty strong margins the last year or two. And as we yet again reflect on Mark Linsmeyer and the Margin Smart newsletter and
John,
projection,
your desktop looks a lot like my brain most times. Can you zoom in or make your screen just a little bit bigger so we can follow that chart with you?
one attribute of Mark's newsletter, and there are again a number of other options from CH and others that will do margin projections, but we'll take class three milk futures and then we'll balance that against corn futures and soybean futures, and that represents both our income and then feed cost side of the balance sheet or the partial budget. And we can project margin potential based on futures out there, or we can project margins. So what we're seeing over the last few weeks, and we've got June 25 projected all the way out now, 12 months into the future, into April of 2026. We've got margins per hundredweight of milk, and classically we've been anywhere from minus 25 cents a hundredweight to maybe $1 to $1.25 a hundredweight in terms of profit or return for every 100 pounds of milk shipped. What we're projecting at the moment, or rather Mark is projecting, in the event that he's wrong, I don't want to share any of that responsibility with him. But we're projecting strong margins in the neighborhood of $2 to even $3 a hundredweight near term in the next 3 to 6 months. And that's fantastic. So we have financial incentive at this point. And I shouldn't just say we always have financial incentive, but we have perhaps a little bit added margin that we don't historically have to work with. And coming back to our feed and nutrition strategies, thinking about rolling back on forage, and that may slightly increase our cost per hundredweight of milk or our feed costs in the near term. But in the event, and we're playing a risk management game here now for those that are farming to the south and to the east, where we don't yet have corn in the ground, or if things stake out a little bit differently and our yields and quality isn't ideal this year, and we're very early. We're only a quarter of the way into the season at this point. But we're playing risk management now a little bit stronger than we maybe anticipated a couple of months ago. So we can roll back on our forages, maybe start to think about stretching our higher quality forage inventory from 2024 and bring in some options that can replace some of that fiber and maybe some of that starch that like a corn silage would bring in. So some good options would be corn gluten feed, soy hulls. Cottonseed isn't necessarily pricing in right now. Distillers grains can come in to some extent, and there are a variety of different options that we can consider to offset the space that forages occupy in our rations. But start to have some of those discussions with your nutritionist now, especially if we're feeling a little bit stressed and we don't have corn in the ground, or we've had heavily delayed first cutting, and we're starting to have some serious questions about what the rest of the year may hold. Because we can always go back and feed more forage, but we can't necessarily reel it back a month from now after it's gone through cows and produced wholesome and nutritious milk.
Right. So the concept of stretching, use the inventory that you have, but kind of like when you make your casserole, you add a little extra pasta in there to help stretch the meat kind of concept. So by adding in some of that corn gluten or possibly the distiller grain, just using the base that you do have. So you don't
Hmm.
have a complete 180 on the diet.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
So John, you do have some great specific questions that came in here. Do you want me to hold them or is it okay to bring them forward?
Hey, hit me
All
with
right.
them.
All right.
We
Let's
can
do
we can
this.
hold this together.
No, not playing favoritism, just the order that they came in. Do you have a calculation to compare the cost of sugar to cornmeal or starch?
Hmm. It's a good question. So cows don't have forage requirements. Cows don't also they also don't have starch requirements. So starch and sugar are two different nutrients. That starch primarily comes from corn salad or corn grain or dry bakery product in some cases brings pretty high amount of starch, but cows don't have a starch requirement necessarily. They've got a digestible carbohydrate requirement. And so that carbohydrate can come from starch, it can come from sugar, it can come from digestible fiber. And so, as we look at and consider perhaps some sugar options, sugar can bring both calories to the diet. So, if we've got a starch-rich feed, such as, or excuse me, a sugar-rich feed, such as molasses, or if we get a good buy on some candy or some other byproduct that has quite a bit of sugar to it, we can look at it in two ways. We can look at it one really simple on just a pound of starch, pound of sugar, and just give and take and assign a value to the pounds of those nutrients per ton. So we can do some quick napkin math. Like if we've got corn, for example, at let's just say $165 a ton at 62% starch, I'll just do some quick calculations. So 65 divided by 2000. And for those of you that aren't tracking with me as I run through the numbers, don't worry, just reach out to me, Cassie. And if you Google my name, I'm not overly hard to get a hold of, although my high school baseball team couldn't figure out how to find me for some annual recognition. So at $165 divided by 2,000 pounds per ton of ground corn, we're looking at somewhere around 8 cents, 8 to 8.5 cents per pound of material. Now we have to correct that for moisture. We have to correct it for starch content. So times say 0.85 for the 15% moisture, and then times 0.72 for 72% starch, we're at somewhere around 5 cents per pound of starch. So I'm not going to go forward and project what a sugar ingredient or sugar rich ingredient
Mhm.
may be valued at or how to make those conversions, but start and benchmark against corn. And as we've just gone through for $165 a ton ground corn or cornmeal, depending on what region you're at and how you call it, probably around 5 cents per pound of that starch. And that would be how I would then look at some sugar rich options. Now there's another discussion point, putting my nutritionist hat on and not necessarily my economic hat.
Mhm.
Sugar can do some different things within the rumen. So starch is broken down in the rumen, but it can create a little bit of a dip in rumen pH, whereas sugar is digested a little bit differently. And so there's quite a bit of research showcasing how if we have less digestible forages, and maybe even in the presence of normal forages, adding a little bit more supplemental sugar to the ration can increase and boost fiber digestibility through some synergies. It'd be kind of like putting a supercharger on an engine. An engine can produce so much horsepower, but if you do something and tweak it a little bit, all of a sudden you can get more horsepower out of the same engine. Our forages have a certain amount of potential, and there are some things we can do to unlock a little bit more potential. So sugar can have some other attributes in the ration. So I tend to look at sugar in a couple of different ways. One is economically, but another is looking at some of the potential benefits and ramifications with microbial growth and fiber degradation. So complex answer to the question, but it's a good one because we're going to have to think about different strategies to feed cows where our forages aren't ideal or aren't in the same sort of supply as they have been in years past.
So naive question, I don't even know how to phrase this. Are all sugars treated the same? Like if I would have molasses versus a bag of Skittles, like I think of the infamous trailer that tipped over on the road.
Great
Mhm.
question. So now we're getting into some of the depths and the unknown. Sugar nutrition is an area where we stand to learn a lot. And I sound a little bit like a professor and an academic in that regard. Like, yeah, we need to do more research, but there are different sugars out there. And so if we compare and contrast, maybe not the sugars by name, but look at a molasses versus a whey permeate. And I was just on another dairy yesterday talking about whey permeate. Whey
Mhm.
permeate is rich in lactose, molasses is rich in sucrose, and those two sugars are also fermented differently. And I will reference Charlie Sniffen, and he's a brilliant guy. He's done some work in this area alongside Mary Beth Dan Darz, I believe, and some other thought leaders. But if I take Charlie at what his word and what he taught me probably 10 years ago at this point, I don't think lactose in whey permeate is fermented or digested as quickly as say a molasses. So if I have whey permeate and molasses that are priced equivalently, I'm going to prefer the molasses as opposed to the whey permeate. Now, those two ingredients often aren't priced the same. We get a lot of whey permeate in the rations at in some cases at no cost or very, very low cost per unit of sugar. But the sugar sources should be considered by your nutritionist. And we can do some different things corresponding to what the type of sugar is. It's a great question.
So at my next team meeting, I can kind of grill my nutritionist, that poor man. I can just kind of grill him and kind of get down to these are some I'm going to say common very loosely here, common questions that they might be fielding or trying to figure out themselves. Is that a correct
Yeah, and
assumption or is that pretty
yeah,
vague?
yeah, and there's a lot of unknown here, right?
Okay.
So this is an area as we look at amino acid nutrition is a thing, and I think that's a little bit more commonly understood by dairy producers and nutritionists. But we're delving into specific fatty acids, and now we're getting way out into the weeds, right? Getting into some different topics. But this is the nature of how you and I can go back and forth together. So we can do some specific fatty acid nutrition, introducing specific fatty acids at different amounts, and I see us doing some similar things with sugars. In the future, we may find certain ratios of sugars, whether it be sucrose to fructose, and fructose is one of the main sugars in forages. I don't know, it's just hypothetically speaking, but we can measure individual sugars in feedstuffs, and we can get a better understanding of what those sugars are. So yeah, Cassie, absolutely, make your nutritionist's head explode, and I'll be right there with him or her.
I swear he loves my questions. Probably
We've got
not,
broad shoulders.
but we'll take it. We'll take it. So another question, being respectful to our listeners here, is for intake at 55 to 60 pounds, what is the minimum forage NDF as a percentage of intake?
Hmm.
Getting in
All
it.
right, so we got a nutritionist out there. So it's got to be a nutritionist question. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at minimums or floors or benchmarks. So what this question is driving at is we look at forage NDF. So there's a total amount of fiber in the ration, but there's fiber contributed from soy hulls, for example, and then there's fiber contributed from corn silage. And those two sources of fiber are different in two ways. One is in the digestibility and how they break down in the rumen, but the other big one is in the physical form and the particle size. So one of the challenges we have in balancing diets is a total amount of fiber in the ration is somewhat informative, but it's maybe 25 to 30% of the story in terms of a floor or a level that we need to ensure we hit and stay above to keep cows healthy. So forage NDF, the amount of forage or the amount of fiber coming from forage, physically effective fiber is another metric, and we're also even integrating fiber digestibility, or rather undigestible fiber, with the physical form, physically effective UNDF. These are all different terms that we as nutritionists will look at and consider so that we can make sure we have kind of minimums out there. Because when we start dropping our forage levels, we have to be mindful of keeping enough physical form in the diet, which we can bring in from straw or other feeds that have a lot of physical form to them. So in terms of a floor, let's start with the forage NDF. So the NRC in 2001, this is 25 years ago, recommended a floor of 17% of the ration should be forage NDF, meaning out of every pound of feed or every 100 pounds of feed consumed, 17% or 17 pounds per 100 of that should be fiber coming from forage. So that's a good floor number. If we look at pounds of forage NDF intake, what was the dry matter intake? Was that 55 pounds?
55 to 60.
So if we have cows consuming 55 pounds of dry feed, and then we take that times 0.17, that's going to be around 9 to 10 pounds of fiber from forage that we would want to look at from kind of a baseline or a floor. I believe there are situations and certain types of diets that we can go below those numbers and still have healthy cows. Because if we feed a lower starch ration and bring in some more sugar, that's just a little bit less of an acidogenic diet. So we can probably stretch and get a little bit below that. And we may need to do that in some situations where we just have hardly any inventory or really strapped for forage. I don't want to just portray one single number as a floor that we have to stay, but to address the question, running through that math, 17% of the ration is a floor according to the NRC. And then at a 55-pound dry matter intake, that's going to be around 9 to 10 pounds of forage fiber on a dry basis.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Testing us here. Yeah, testing us.
Thank you for clarifying that one. I know the technical questions are just as important as my broad stroke ones, so keep them coming, guys.
Proven to myself, I'm going to be able to hang with my kids through their math lessons for at least another year or two before they escape us.
Good luck. I wish you the best of luck. But switching back again, as we were talking about regionally, just looking at the planting season of where we're at, I apologize for the bit of the whiplash I'm going to give you here. I don't want to be like beating on a drum that we've just lost cadence with here, but as for those that don't have corn in the ground, they're sitting on seed that might not be beneficial to put in the ground. What would be some other pivots? Yes, we talked about some of the other alternatives, of stretching the feed, but if you're still trying to get something in the ground, maybe corn's not the answer anymore. What would be some other substitutions?
So we're getting into a lot of great content, a lot of good questions coming forth, and I like this one too and how you phrased it. What would be a good option beyond corn? I don't know that we need to look beyond corn just yet. So I'm going to put my screen back up and let's take a look at a tool actually that is a new development. I've referenced this group. I think it's High Plains Regional Climate Center. They've had some great tools available for agronomists, for nutritionists, for advisors, for growers that have existed for many years. And I've referenced this group primarily for the Midwest over the last few years to look at growing degree days and to do some projections on when corn, for example, may be silking, and then based upon silking, project out harvest timing. I've not used these tools this earlier in the year. However, these tools and this tool in particular have immense value for us. So the website is hprcc.unl.edu, et cetera. Maybe we can link to this on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, et cetera. For those of you viewing, I believe I can share a QR code so that if you're watching this or you've come and sign in after the fact, if you scan this QR code with your phone up on my screen, this will take you to this website. So in the absence of being able to share bookmarks, this is at least something you can scan with a QR reader or your phone app. But let's take a look at this tool and let's look into Eastern or rather Western New York, the Eastern region. And let's look at, in fact, actually this scenario I have up here, we don't even need to run this model. As I was talking with another nutritionist this morning, here we're now June 10, early to mid-June. Are we out of options for corn, and do we need to start considering something different? So I'll get to your question on some of the other options we have, but I don't think we're in emergency situation yet in terms of not being able to put corn in the ground. Reason being is detailed on this chart. So I hope it's showing up okay on your screen, but I'll walk through this and verbalize it. So with this tool, we can choose a location. We can select our planting date. We can choose now that this new version of the tool has many different crops. So I'm looking at corn and we can put in prior year for comparative purposes. I've not done this in this case. We're just looking at relative to long-term trends. And so right now, we're planting corn today. So this tool won't let us project out and plant corn 2 weeks from now. But let's say we plant corn today on June 10 in roughly Lima, New York. And that may not mean anything to a lot of you, but if you look at Rochester, Buffalo, south of that area, there's a heck of a lot of awesome dairy herds and cows and cattle in that area. So we're looking at that general region. And I know based on understanding of what's available for seed genetics and talking to some colleagues, there's 75 to 80-day corn out there that we can go get. And is it going to be the ideal hybrid? I don't care, honestly, at this point. It's just the relative maturity. And as we look at and compare and contrast corn with our other emergency options, such as sorghum sudan, oats in the case of if we really get strung out and can't get anything into the ground, thinking about the two objectives we are going to have today is one, getting tons of forage to fill our bunkers or bunkers or bags or silos to the extent we can, but then also managing risk and driving for as consistent as of feed as we can produce. And this consistency topic is one you're going to hear about more from my end in the months to come because I've long talked about driving forage quality higher or things we can do to change forage quality. Well, I want to pivot a little bit and just talk consistency. What can we do to bring consistency to the ration in our nutrients and our forages? Let's change our goals and focus this year and see what we can do. And so coming back to what corn can bring to the ration and from a consistency standpoint, even if we can get corn in the ground today, and I think we can, corn has the chance of bringing some starch and putting an ear on. Whereas if we pivot and we say, all right, we're going to scrap corn and we're going to look at sorghum or Sudan, we can get some digestible fiber, we can get some tons, but we're not going to give ourselves that chance and opportunity to bring a little bit of starch in the ration and be able to offset some of that starch and grain or sugar. So if we look at, say, 75 to 80-day corn, and on the right-hand side of this tool, we then have a chart. And this is looking at starting growing degree day accumulations today on June 9, June 10, but with 80-day corn and based upon just sort of the last 30 to 20 to 30 years of average growing degree day accumulation, that corn, assuming it germinates and gets out of the ground, it's going to silk somewhere between the 1st of August and the end of August. So somewhere in middle August, we're going to go through pollination and tasseling and silking and pollination. And let's just say August 15th is our average, if everything kind of falls to the norm here. August 15th is our silking and tasseling and germination date. Well, then you add 45 days to that, and we're going to be roughly at harvest for silage, which would be then putting us around beginning October. We're still in good shape. So if we can find and source some 75 to 80-day corn and we can get that in the ground in the next week to 10 days, we've got a great shot to put a crop up that's going to yield some starch. So I would say hold off on just completely pulling back from corn. We certainly don't want to be putting 90, 95, 100-day corn in the ground. That's going to be a mess. But if we can source, and I know we can source some shorter day corn, go find some of that and then put ourselves at least in position to capture a little bit more normal looking silage for the next week to 10 days. Now, if we find ourselves a week to 10 days out and it's continuing to rain and we haven't been able to get in fields and plant, now we're in the position of saying, all right, we've missed the corn window. We're mid to late July, and we're going to be looking for sorghum Sudan are probably going to be pretty good options. They tend to do a little bit better with both heath units, but also a little bit drier soil. We may or may not have that if we are really wet and we're able to get in fields, but the forecast looks wet. We may look at some forage oats. I know that there are prevent plant discussions and payment insurance payment discussions that are happening. But I would preferentially look for, say, sorghum Sudan, maybe a male sterile option with a brown midrib trait, so that we can get a little bit more digestible fiber out of that, and then look to harvest that. Probably maybe even a couple of times where we get it. Typically, we'll look for about 48 inches of height and then go out and swap that and harvest it. If we harvested it at, say, 36 to 48 inches and then look to maybe capture a second cutting on some regrowth that year, we're going to be looking for tons, but look for some of those brown midrib options at least for milk cow feed.
Yeah, definitely. And I just, whenever I have these corn discussions of, what do we do if we don't have corn silage or how do we manage it? Just, I hear our Southwest consultants in the back of my ear just laughing at me of what do you mean? What are you going to do? Like, this is so old news to
It's
them.
normal. Yeah, it's just
Yes.
normal, right?
So
Because
they're like,
forage is
guys,
expensive. We have to pay a lot for water to
yes.
get these silages and this alfalfa hay. Yeah. Hmm.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And honestly, John, you transitioned really well in my mind with the idea of the topic of consistency. This has been a message that you've shared with us time and time again, but it also blends really well into the next phase. I mean, we're in June. If you haven't already done a first cutting of hay or haylage
Hmm.
or baled hay or whatever you're working with, I mean, I think that blends really well into the message or even the pulse of consistency or let's just, yeah, I guess let's go twofold. A little bit in the consistency discussion, but how it aligns with the discussion of alfalfa. Where are we at right now, regardless if it's straight up alfalfa or what you're doing for haylage?
So coming back to our growers here in the Midwest and closer to home, within a few miles of where I'm situated today in Southwest Wisconsin, we've been able for the most part get pretty good timing on our first cutting. There was an earlier window where we got some excellent Rockstar feed, and then a later couple of windows where we got some pretty average first cutting. And that's not to portray it as bad in any way, shape, or form. So I was taking a look at some of the Rockriver Laboratory and then the early nutrition results, and there are some great tools where we can look at feed tests through all the labs out there. It's still too early for me to get an assessment of what our first cuttings are looking at, looking like a nutritional value. We would typically have this conversation, say, a month from now, in July when reflecting back. But uh, one thing coming back to some of what I uncovered with the growing degree day tools, I knew we were behind in growing degree days out east, but I didn't perceive necessarily as I looked at Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and into Minnesota, we're actually behind now in growing degree days relative to long-term trends. And so what that means relative to our alfalfa crop this year and this consistency discussion is we took our first crop off anywhere from middle of May to end of May for the most part. And so now in a lot of with the earlier window growers that was harvested, we're 28 days from that first cutting of middle of May, and yet our growing degree days have been well below average. So I've had some folks ask me, all right, what's the appropriate height for alfalfa for second, third cutting, et cetera, where we should start thinking about cutting? Well, that's a separate discussion. Don't interpret height at all beyond first cutting. Height is reasonable to project alfalfa leaf to stem ratio and quality and feed value for first cutting. But after that, your height's pretty much worthless. We want to be getting out, and this is just me beating the same drum I have for the last number of years. Walk your fields, get an idea of where the crops are at in physiological maturity. And we've got immature crops 28 days after our prior cutting right now. I would say for the most part, I've heard this time and time again. I was out on another dairy yesterday and they were commenting that, oh, well, we should be coming up on cutting our second crop today, this week, but you walk out into the field and it's immature. It's nowhere close to ready. Exactly. Like 28 days means nothing. This year, 28 days, we're probably going to be 35 or maybe even more days when that crop is physiologically ready to go and cut, where it's coming out of vegetative stage. Maybe you're starting to feel a couple of buds. That's when we want to go. Years past, where we've had an abundance of heat units, the crop may be ready in 17 to 21 days. And if we cut at 28 days, well, then we're feeding tree bark when we get into that feed later on in the year. So speaking to that consistency topic we spoke about before, it's important to monitor our physical maturity right now. And I would say get out in fields at 21 to 28 days post harvest and just get your hands on alfalfa, go in a few different fields, a few different spots within a field and feel for buds. Just kind of take your agronomist with you or have them do it on your behalf. There's some nutritionists that'll do this as well. Get an idea of what the physiological maturity is and then time based on that, and also the weather window, because we've had spotty weather windows in the Midwest. Out east, I won't even talk about, but we have to be mindful both in our nutritional value, but then also the likelihood of getting rain on that crop. And so if we have, say, a window of a day or two right now where we could get excellent quality, but we're looking at a pretty heavy front out on the horizon, I'm actually going to probably forego that quality if there's a likelihood of getting a little bit more stable conditions, say 3 to 5 days without rain, just so that we don't get rained on feed. It's this risk balance all toward we want the most consistent crop, even if it's not the ideal nutritional value. I would much rather have consistency as opposed to some of the feed they got rained on and they got buried in the silo or buried in the bunker. And now we're having to deal with that and feed around that.
Okay. So when we're looking at, you said don't go by height, but if you had to kind of, I guess, relearn, teach your brain,
Hmm.
reteach your brain, what would be some other cues that it's ready for that next cutting when you look at that maturity?
Physiological maturity, right? So it's going to walk out into the field, and so with alfalfa and grass as well, we can flag leaf with grasses is an indicator that we're going to be turning over and going reproductive. We can feel the heads and the grasses that head out. For the grasses that don't head out, well, then it's doing some scissor clippings to get an idea. And for scissor clippings, and those are very helpful for second through fifth cuttings. What I recommend is taking a 1 square foot either diameter or area tool and going out in the field, throwing it randomly in a spot, working it to the ground, and then cutting all of the material within that 1 square foot, simulating whatever our cut height is on our cutter bar on our hay bind. So probably couple 2, 3 inches off the ground, cutting that material and then cutting it up into 1 or 2 inch pieces into a bucket, going through that process a few times within a field, mixing that up, sampling, getting that off to the lab. That's going to give us the accurate depiction of what that fiber and protein level is and that feed value is. But in the absence of doing some scissor clippings like that for immediate feedback, especially with alfalfa, I like just walking out and you can feel buds. We can see buds, we can feel buds. So around 21, I would say 17 to 21 days after we've cut our prior crop, just take a drive out, walk through some fields. We can get this done in a matter of an hour, look at a few fields and get an idea of where that crop's at. And like we're at currently 28 days to 30, well, probably 20 to 28 days after our prior cutting. There aren't going to be buds anywhere. We are going to be strongly in vegetative state yet, just because we haven't had the growing degree days. So watch and feel for those buds.
Sure. So also, Naive, maybe it's more of a weather question. Besides temperature, does it also require so many sunny days? I mean, we've had so much cast over. Does that have an influence over some of those bud growth as well?
I like how you phrase it as cast over and not burning Canada. This smoke and just the haze that exists not only over Wisconsin but over Michigan, over New York, Minnesota. I mean, I had a really interesting vantage point last week flying back from New York. It was smoky in New York. Took off, landed in Detroit. It was smoky in Detroit. I took off. I got to view it from above. Landed in Madison, smoky in Madison. I don't know. How's that for an answer? I don't know what that does. We've had that question a number of times. I'm not aware of any greenhouse studies. There probably are some out there. I just haven't come across them or had anybody point them out. But we can't test it in fields, so I don't really know what kind of impact that lesser photosynthetic impact or photosynthetic potential has on our crop. I mean, don't know. It's a great question.
Time might tell. If we're lucky, I don't know. I'm fortunate. Whichever direction you want to go with that. All right, that is fair. So one last question that I have before I'm going to let you go and give us our final takeaways, if you will, is the if we had to pivot, say we're further in the growing season, I mean, we may have put some feed up, but what would be some good feeds to begin thinking about contracting? Like we've been stretching our feed, but I want to add X, Y, and Z as we continue to think about obviously optimal nutrition for our cows. You just can't leave that waste. You have phenomenal working engines there. You just got to take care of them. So what would be good feeds to begin thinking about contracting if our forage quality and inventory isn't shaping up?
We're going to be looking for digestible fiber. We're going to be looking for fiber to augment what our forage likely isn't going to bring, either in quantity or in quality, or maybe both. So, some of the options that we can consider would be soy hulls, wheat midds to some extent, corn gluten feed, cotton seed. We can buy hay and we can find some other grassy hays, maybe truck those in from some different areas, but fiber rich feeds. And in terms of contracting and looking for some good values, relatively speaking, there are a number of good tools out there, such as the University of Wisconsin's FeedVal, which I was a co-author of a number of years back, or Sesame from Ohio State, that will you can assign prices to feeds and then you can choose what nutrients we want to sort of equate that value to. And I would encourage us to look at fiber, digestible fiber, and there, in the case of corn gluten feed, I guess distiller's grains was another one I threw out before. That can have a little bit of fiber to it. Even canola meal can bring some fiber into rations. We don't think of canola meal as a feed that brings fiber, but it can have 25 to 30% fiber per ton. So those are going to be some of the options that we should then look at in a feed val or sesame type situation. As I was looking at a FeedSense tool now that my team runs monthly, and I was looking at just the carbohydrates, soy hulls looks to be kind of an average in terms of break even, the cost relative to the value it brings in. Corn gluten feed actually is looking pretty good right now. And distiller's grains always looks good in these evaluations. It's underpriced relative to the predicted value. There are some other considerations in DDGs, wet or dry, such as the fat content that can prove to be challenging a little bit within the rumen for milk fat. And then long ago, there were some considerations and concerns about mycotoxin contamination within distillers grains. We had a really clean growing season for the most part across the US last year. So mycotoxins aren't a huge concern on my radar. I think it warrants looking again at DDGs, especially in cases where we're really strapped for feed inventory and we're just looking to buy some feed at the best prices we can.
Mhm. And I also understand and respect the concept of beggars can't be choosers, but as you're going, if you have to go and bite the bullet as far as going into some of those contract feeds, is there a way that you can control or kind of manage the quality or the consistency of those feed ingredients that you're bringing on and adding in? What would you be looking for, or how do you consider this?
That I love where your head's at, and we are, I won't say at the mercy of these feed ingredients, but one of the long-term assumptions from many nutritionists that I previously supported, but now acting in that capacity, is that these feeds are consistent, and that's not the case. Pretty much any feed ingredient fed to dairy cattle at more than 1 to 2, maybe 2 to 3 pounds per cow per day is contributing a sizable amount of nutritional value. And experience now, speaking, working with dairies the last 5 to 7 years, where we've been testing feed ingredients, all of them, not just forages, but using forage-like feed testing for our commodity feeds, primarily through Rock River, but we can do anywhere, is looking at the nutritional value in, say, our corn gluten feed or our canola meal. And we will not be able to control the consistency. There's been theories about staying with one supplier. I've seen even within supplier within a few month period of time where we see ebbs and flows in nutritional value. But I would encourage you to analyze these feed ingredients that we're bringing in at higher amounts, testing them like we do forages, and then managing that nutrient supply in the ration week in, week out, like we do to manage some of the variation that exists within forages. So this is an area Bill Weiss, Norman St. Pierre have done a lot of great work at Ohio State. I've got a lot of practical experience working with dairies and from east to west coast and north to south. And there's a lot of opportunity there to uncover some, let's say, feed cost opportunities, but zero in our nutrient supply when we're bringing in these feeds.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And we did have another question come in. So should we focus on 30-hour NDF in byproduct feeds?
So what that question is referring to is that fiber digestibility within byproduct feeds or forages. And so 5 to 10 years ago, I would say, got to a little bit more of a common understanding across the feed labs of how to measure fiber digestibility. When we're measuring nutrient digestibilities through feed labs, whether it be fiber or more recently trying to look at starch and how digestible that is within the rumen, the laboratories are using living cows and the rumen digesting bugs from the living cows. So we know how consistent cows are from one another, right? Not very. So then if we're using cows in a lab test, those tests, the lab assays aren't necessarily overly consistent. This was the focus of my PhD work now 15, 20 years ago, something like that, if I date myself. And so yes, we should use some sort of fiber digestibility insights, and we can use that 30-hour fiber digestibility value, not only on our forages, but now the labs also have measures on our byproduct feeds. So we can look at soy hulls, for example, relative to corn gluten feed or relative to DGGs, and so we can start to account for some of that information in our diet benchmarking. But We have a little bit less, I would say, track record and history in terms of using the fiber digestibility insights from the labs on those co-products. But that's absolutely something that could come into our diet and nutrition strategy.
All right. Well, thank you. And as we wrap up today's discussion, John, what would be, I mean, we covered a lot of ground. There's a lot, figuratively and literally, there's just a lot going on, a lot of top of mind discussion when it all comes things to weather, everything we can't control. So if you had to give us two actionable, two solid takeaways from today, what would you like us to go out and walk with?
Assume nothing and team up with both your agronomist and your nutritionist to just assess where are we at today, what are our objectives, both near and long term, and should we start to consider some mid-season game plan adjustments, some of what we discussed, for example, in that Hordes article, and potentially some mid-year nutrition strategies if we're starting to question our feed quality and inventory and availability coming out of the 25 growing season. So assume nothing, have these discussions now. We're still relatively early in the growing season, but we can't go back in time. Like if we find ourselves kind of behind between a rock and a hard place in August and September and haven't made any adjustments, we may look back in retrospect and say, shoot, I wish we would have done that back in June. So now's the opportunity to carry a few of those conversations. Now, to create panic, that's not the case at all. We're going to get through. We're going to be good. We're going to be solid. But have a bit more proactive discussion, perhaps, if it's been a challenging start for your year.
Absolutely. Get that game plan and more or less get your game face on. Or
Yeah.
else we're at.
And let's go for consistency. Let's do what we can. Let's manage toward a norm and avoid outlier stuff to the extent we can.
Mhm. Stuff in a loose word. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your time here. Thank you for this great discussion. And folks, I promise you, John is a phenomenally approachable, great guy to have in your back pocket in the way of fielding questions. So reach out whenever you can. We're excited for his new shift, his new career change, quote unquote, as he gets boots back on the ground as a dairy nutrition and management consultant with Progressive Dairy Solutions. So thank you again for joining us here on the Dairy Signal. As you go out today in your journeys, wherever you're at, again, special thank you to our national sponsors who help make the Dairy Signal and a lot of what PDPW does day in and day out possible. So again, thank you to our national sponsors for not only standing along PDPW, but in truly and in kind supporting the dairy producers all across the country. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again later this week. Take care, everyone.